We will transition over to our next policy preview, and I'll hand it over to Councilwoman Sarah Parady. Are you going to stay? You're going to come down? You can come down. Okay. Who's going to present a potential policy that she would like to bring forward. And thank you also for bringing this to budget and policy. I know things are constantly moving very quickly, but this is our chance to kind of preview and get some questions asked before it's officially before a committee. So I'll turn it over to you.
This is my first time at this podium. Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. So before I dive into the PowerPoint, I want to just recognize that Councilwoman Lewis, I think, is on Zoom, and this is very much also her bill, and she's sick, and so I'm going to try to do my best to be both of us at once. I also want to acknowledge the advocates that have helped raise up and flesh out this policy for several years now, through a lot of different types of advocacy, including research reports that they do in consultation with DU and others. And I want to say that in particular that it was Councilmember Lewis's brainchild to do a little bit of a survey about this issue, which is kind of at the end of the slide deck. And finally, really glad to be following the elevated Denver analysis, because I think it's so important for us to remember that our policy on homelessness has to come from understanding that people aren't at fault for becoming or remaining homelessness. These are structural human kinds of factors that they're but for the grace, you know. So the purpose of this proposal is that I'd like for us to set policy for the city based on medical evidence on when we will ask people to exit shelters and move during cold temperatures, and for when we will open our warming shelters. And to level set on what we currently have, right now the city has a written policy that's not in ordinance, that's just set through the mayor's office for when we will open warming shelters. That has a temperature threshold of 20 degrees plus some factors related to snow and wind. And we have no policy that sets any temperature parameters for when we will remove someone's tent or other habitation based on right-of-way enforcement, camping ban enforcement, or kind of our broad public health and safety authority. So then getting into the slides. It worked. Just to define the problem a little bit, the idea is that in the interest of public health and safety, protecting people from frostbite and from death, this ordinance would hold off on encumbrance removals by the city, or I guess any type of removals of shelter, and ensure that warming shelters open when temperatures fall to or below freezing, because that is the point at which human bodies become very much at risk. The relevant research, which you all heard some of in a presentation in the safety committee from CU public health researcher Dr. Josh Barakas, a couple of different studies have shown similar things. The bottom line being that the risk of death if you're unsheltered and out in the cold and experiencing homelessness, even during moderate cold stress, is increased by 84%, or in other words, almost double your risk of death in those same conditions when it's not cold outside. And then sort of a different study that framed things a little bit differently, your odds of experiencing some kind of hypothermic event, which include hypothermia or up to and including death, so injury and death from the cold, increased 1.6-fold, so well over double, with every 5 degrees Celsius decrease in temperature. We should have converted that to Fahrenheit. I can't do that in my head. So, you know, we know that human bodies are not built for extended time in cold weather. Anyone who lives in Colorado knows that. And the way this shows up in our hospitals and for people that are experiencing homelessness is often hospitalization and amputation. So loss of fingers, toes, even limbs because of the cold. And it can also result in death. There's, you know, compounding factors. People are less likely to discharge once they've been hospitalized for frostbite. Once they discharge, they're often back in the cold. They're less likely to have the ongoing supportive medical treatment that you need, which just magnifies the volume of the harm. There are also injuries from the cold that can happen even aside from freezing, such as what's commonly called trench foot, which often happens when it's wet and cold but not freezing. I'm going to put an image up that I just want to warn people is a little bit graphic. It's what frostbite looks like on a human foot. And I felt like it was important to include because I know that I was really staggered the first time I saw an image of that. Just really awful injuries. You know, imagine trying to function in the world without your toes or your fingers. A little bit about kind of because we're thinking about removing people from shelters that generally speaking are tents. That's how people are making do in our city right now in the lack of more appropriate shelter or housing. And this is kind of common sense again for Coloradoans, but tents are designed to protect you from the cold, right? That's why people take tents when they go up on Everest or whatever. They usually have temperature ratings. They don't produce a very warm environment, but your body heat accumulates in the tent. They protect you from the wind chill. They protect you from snow and wet. And then sleeping bags often also have warmth ratings that can add like 15 to 20 degrees of warmth. Depending on the tent, it can add about 10 to 20 degrees of warmth compared to the outside itself. So it's not as warm as your house, but that's a huge difference to the kinds of injuries and effects that we're talking about. And when we talk about enforcement of our various, city authorities to remove tents in cold weather, we're talking about removing that many degrees of protection from somebody who's, huddled up against the cold. So again, a tent obviously is not the same as your house. It doesn't eliminate the risk of frostbite or even death, but it certainly reduces the risk. And then as far as our sheltering policy, where we do have a citywide policy set, again, not through ordinance, right now we open warming shelters when existing shelter capacity is exceeded and temperatures drop below 20 degrees, there's over 2 inches of snow, or there's a wind chill advisory. So one of those 3 factors, in addition to existing shelter capacity being exceeded. This temperature threshold is just not evidence-based. As we saw in the presentation in safety last week and some of the studies that we looked at, the point at which the risk of frostbite and death exists is 32 degrees. It's freezing. All of our bodies are at great risk at that point. New York City has a 32-degree threshold. One of my colleagues, Councilmember Romero Campbell, pointed out to me that DPS has a 32-degree threshold for when we'll take kids inside. And that's simple, is because we know that that's when it's too cold to be outside. This slide, the cost-benefit title here actually isn't the way I would like to frame this so much, because I don't think that we really should be doing trade-offs when it comes to people's lives. But I think that the thing that's really striking to me about this is that last December, so a year ago, in one of our Denver hospitals, we have many hospitals in the metro area, in 1 month of winter, there were 50 homeless people who came in with a frostbite diagnosis. And then this talks about the cost of that to our medical providers, which is very real. But to me, it's just showing the scope of the problem. 50 people with frostbite in a month of cold weather who were experiencing homelessness at one hospital. So the proposed changes, there's 3 sections where the city has power to remove shelters. One is our general sort of public health authority, and that's sometimes relied on as a basis to do kind of cleanups. So this would alter that by adding a section that says that the manager of DDPHE may not order the removal of a shelter when the temperature predicted by the National Weather Service will be 32 degrees or lower, and that's just during the period when the removal will actually occur. So it's not that the entire day the temperature can't go below 32, but it can't go below 32 during the time of the removal, or for 4 hours after, to give people time to resettle. Because if your tent is moved, it takes a lot of time to pack up your possessions, get somewhere else, and get the tent back up and get to safety, or relative safety, I should say. And then there's an exception here that came out of conversation with the mayor's office that if the manager of public health certifies that removal is necessary to mitigate a condition that would cause greater imminent peril to the health or safety of any person than the threat posed by the exposure to the weather. And that's the right standard. If we're going to be moving someone's shelter and putting them out in the cold, it should be because of an equal or greater risk. If we allow that to be done because of a lesser kind of health risk, then we're in the land where it's not healthy and safe for people to live in tents. So there's always going to be a reason to remove tents due to health and safety. If we allow like a generic health and safety exception, it essentially totally swallows the rule, and we may as well not engage in the exercise. So then parallel language for enforcement under the other 2 areas where the city has the power to remove people's shelters, which are the urban camping ban and right-of-way enforcement. And just a note that because it's the manager of public health that has to certify as to the health rationale, if it's one of those other agencies doing the enforcement, the public health department could make that certification after the fact if necessary because of time. So in other words, you're imagining like an emergent kind of condition that would be required to remove a tent. If there's an emergency that requires the police to go and remove a tent, or fire to remove a tent, or right-of-way enforcement to remove a tent, they don't necessarily have to wait around for public health to provide them a written certification before they do that. And then finally, this is right now drafted as a separate ordinance. And I think I do want to pause here and say that I think this cold weather sheltering portion, there's probably a little bit more conversation to be had here with advocates about the exact shape of this. But as drafted, it says that the executive director of host, in coordination with the other relevant agencies, will order the opening of warming centers at 32 degrees instead of 20. I think this needs to be edited to also add the other two factors that are in the existing city policy. And we may need to flesh out kind of what does it mean to open warming centers and so on. But this is the broad idea there. And it's again, because the 20-degree threshold is not based in science. 32 degrees is where it should be. The next portion here, and let me just check my notes actually. I feel like I had a comment that I wrote down I wanted to make, and I'm forgetting, so I'm going to pause before I move into the survey work that Be Connected did. Oh yeah, so I just wanted to make a quick note to kind of bring us to the current moment. We last weekend there were 4 deaths of unsheltered people in the city. We know that it was our first cold snap. We also know that some of those likely were attributed to overdose, but there's unsurprisingly a study that showed that when you're in prolonged exposure to cold, you are about 30% more likely to die of an overdose, and that may be because of sort of biological feedback loops. Both of those things slow your breathing. Your body's under greater stress in the cold. It may also be because of sort of behavioral changes to do with cold that we don't exactly know of. But that's what it was, I believe, a 2019 study, and that's what it showed. So I just want to sort of say that when people are dying in the cold, even if the immediate factor is overdose, it doesn't mean that, that the cold weather wasn't a factor there as well. And in fact, the study shows it may have been in many of those instances. Okay, so then this is a little bit of work that was done at the proposal of Councilmember Lewis in her office with Be Connected. They did a community engagement survey trying to talk to people about what the impacts, I guess, are of current city policy. And in particular, sort of this question of like, why are people in their tents in freezing temperatures to begin with? They asked a question about asking people to agree whether they were neutral or whether they disagreed, with a series of questions around how they respond to cold weather, and also to and then some free response questions about their perceived risks compared to cold weather. And so I think this is pretty striking. The vast majority of people surveyed do not feel that they have adequate clothing to be outdoors in freezing temperatures, which again goes to show how important that tent can be. The vast majority do not feel that they have adequate shelter to keep themselves safe in freezing temperatures, which shows the importance of warming facilities. People have mixed levels of confidence in city programs and services. I would say not that many feel strongly confident in those things in freezing temperatures. Most are neutral or not confident. And then this one is really striking. Fear of losing my personal belongings impacts my decision to seek shelter in the winter. So if we're wondering why do people stay in tents instead of trying to get to an existing shelter or warming center, oftentimes there are beds open in the winter, not always. Sometimes they do fill up all the way. This is why, because if you're living in a tent, you have things that belong to you there. And I've observed that to be true at attending cleanups. People, especially people who have been recently evicted or recently lost housing, they're trying to retain as many of their personal belongings as they can. And that's for all the reasons that we all keep belongings, emotional reasons, pragmatic reasons. And then here's one of the free response, talking to people, trying to get a sense of like what kinds of things would justify moving someone's shelter in freezing temperatures, what poses a greater risk than that. And I'll just kind of let people read these. But the last one that says that's pretty much it, there is no greater risk, I think fairly captures the sentiment. And then this additional feedback is mostly just about people's fear of cold, the need for more availability of shelters. And then this last one, Denver rocks and gives me a lot of hope. So I'm happy that that person is out there. Actually, I'm not happy they're outside. I wish they were inside, but I'm happy that they have hope from what we're doing right now as a city. Okay, and I think I'll end that there. These are these slides that are a little bit less qualitative are also really useful, these ones in gray. So I would encourage people to look those over. And then there's a summary slide. Again, the majority of unhoused residents don't feel they have adequate clothing or shelter. Only half have confidence in city programs meeting their needs, and a large majority cite the fear of losing their personal belongings, especially ID cards and documents that impact their decision to seek shelter when it's freezing. My conclusion outside the slides is that I just want to emphasize that I think our city policies around cold weather, first of all, I think that we're the body that should set policy for the city on this, and that those policies should be designed to reduce harm and save lives. We know that cold and snow are life and death matters. We're Coloradans, and we have to get our policies right so that ultimately people will have places to live. But because we're not there right now, we have to grapple with the real impact of displacing people from tents into the cold and accept that as long as we live in a city where there are tent encampments, the moment of a cold snap is not the moment to question why that person isn't in congregate shelter. I also want to say that one of the very first things that I think put me on the path to ultimately running for office to sit alongside all of you was when I started volunteering at the emergency cold weather shelter in my neighborhood after a man froze to death on their steps. They were a church, and so they opened up as a shelter after that. And I sort of will never forget everyone's feeling of having let him down in our neighborhood. And I think we're continuing to let people down as long as we aren't doing what the evidence suggests. Thank you, guys. Does Councilwoman Lewis want to add anything? I know she's on Zoom and also sick, so.
We will let her. Councilwoman Lewis, do you want to?
Don't add anything. You did a wonderful job, Sarah. Thank you so much. Our Councilwoman Parady.
Let's go ahead. Mic is off again. Let's go ahead and take the slide deck down. Councilwoman Alvidrez.
Thank you so much, Council President, and thank you, Councilwoman Parady, for bringing this forward. I admire your heart and how much you do for your community, for our community, for Denver. One of my questions, I just wanted to get a little bit of clarity, which I feel like you did explain, but just to double check. You said so like, for example, if it was going to be 32 degrees tonight, enforcement could happen before that temperature is predicted. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. So the intention is to say that essentially people can't be removed from their tents when it's actually 32 or for a short period thereafter. And of course, since the enforcement decision has to be made in advance, we went with when the temperature is predicted to be 32 or lower at the time the removal would actually occur. So what you said is correct.
Mm-hmm. So like the way it goes right now, there's like a 72-hour notice? And then, so it'd be like what the temperature is 72 hours from now?
So the different notice periods depend on kind of the type of removal. There's a 7-day notice under the Lyle settlement. And so I think in those circumstances, the removal might have to be canceled and renoticed. There are some other sort of reasons for removal where it can occur more immediately and don't require the posting at all.
Like the parks thing that happened recently, mm-hmm. right? Okay, and then something that I just think would be helpful is to know how often does that happen in a year, mm-hmm. approximately. Maybe if we could get that data.
So I didn't look at timeframes, and it was unscientific, but I looked at the temperature history for the last couple of winters in Denver, and what I can say is that like the vast majority of days in Denver, it gets to 40 or 42 in the winter. And then as you guys know from living here, we have these cold snaps where for, a period of time it's lower than that. Mm-hmm. But most winter days have a period that is like 40 degrees or higher.
Yeah.
Most winter days also have a period that is 30 degrees or lower. Right. So,
Well, again, thank you for this work. I really admired that, as how much work that you've done and that firsthand experience. So thank you. I appreciate you. And thank you, Council President.
Thank you. Councilman Hines.
Thank you, Council President. May I ask Mr. Fenton to come up and chat on behalf of DDPHE? And will you let us know who you are? I said who you are, but I could be lying.
Thank you, Councilman. Will Fenton from Denver Public Health and Environment.
So can you help me understand why the city came up to its current idea of, I think it's 20 degrees, and why not 32 degrees? Or, I mean, is there a particular calculation there, or is that just because of the way it's always been? Or
Thank you for the question. To my knowledge, DDPHE was part of an effort from several agencies kind of providing different input on two different topics that I think we're talking about, which would be cold weather overnight sheltering and then daytime warming centers, right? And so from a public health perspective, just like it's never safe to sleep outside, it's never safe to be outside when you're too hot or too cold, no matter what temperature it is. But this was and is a citywide plan that, again, is informed by many different agencies, including that, but not exclusive to that public health perspective. All that to say, while, again, the DDPHE kind of provided that input, I think those different thresholds were set with input from many different agencies.
Okay. I recognize, so I think by default, and this is to maybe Councilmember Parady, by default, I can understand that we might defer to our public health experts to come up with the appropriate guidance. So long as they were able to make that decision entirely from a public health perspective and not from, not considering anything else, but just making sure that we don't, say, for example, have 4 people die when there's a cold snap. I guess if public, so this is an informational item. We're not voting on adopting legislation now, but so this isn't, I don't have any further questions for you, Mr. Fenton, but I guess what I would want to know from the city or from DDPHE, why not adopt 32 degrees as a standard? And frankly, the legislation, I would prefer our public health experts, our public health experts define that rather than have to rely on legislation, because then we get pretty prescriptive. But in this case, we do continue to have people lose their limbs and their lives. And so, Councilmember Parady, I want to thank you for bringing this forward, because we want to make sure that our job is public health, safety, and welfare. And, our city's number one job is public health, safety, and welfare. And I don't know if any of those are benefited if our policies right now allow us to continue to have people perish. So those are just my comments. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you. Councilmember Flynn?
Thank you. Councilwoman, slide 8, the cost benefit. You're not implying that the savings from frostbite treatments not having to be rendered would cover our cost? Oh, okay.
Not at all.
Okay. Because it looked like it was sort of balanced.
No, but I think, for example, our safety net hospital, which we do,
right.
I think it's important to think about the cost to other systems that interrelate with the city and that, provide for people's basic needs, as we do at times as well. So certainly no direct cost relationship, but the cost here is a way of expressing both the harm that happens to human bodies and
right.
That this does impose real costs on our hospitals, including our safety net hospital.
Right, certainly. And with the presentation we had at safety last week, of course, about the hazards of trying to live out in the cold weather, I have a great concern that lessening our ability to move people into shelter would lead to more death on the street. On slide 10, what would be the intent or the purpose of prohibiting a citation for violating the urban camping ban, which isn't forcing anybody to move right there in the moment, but is simply a citation? Why would you want to prohibit that?
As opposed to just the arrest portion? That's a good question. My understanding is that, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that usually camping ban enforcement takes the form of arrests and enforcement, meaning make people move. I don't think the police typically do go out and cite people.
Right.
And if I'm right about that, and otherwise there's nothing else that I'm missing here as I stand here and answer the question on the fly, we could probably remove the issue of citation and just say no law enforcement officer shall make an arrest or otherwise enforce this section. But typically the enforcement comes under the third prong there and involves having people move their shelter. Okay. So that's a good catch, and I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
And can I just address the first comment about making it more difficult to get people into shelter? I'm not sure if this is where your mind was going with it, but I believe that the mayor would continue to have the authority once people are moved indoors as part of House 1000 to remove their shelter because it's no longer a shelter where someone is living.
Did you give any thought to if the temperature were going to be 20 or below or freezing, to an ordinance that would compel or require people to go to warming shelters rather than trying to freeze to death?
I believe that would be unconstitutional.
Would it?
Yeah, I think so. You typically can't commit people, or I mean, you can either arrest them for committing a crime, or you can
Right.
commit them if they're a serious danger to themselves. And I think large scale, I mean, I think almost
Right.
certainly any approach along those lines would be unconstitutional.
If the intent is to save lives, we have the officers in our district in Southwest Denver who do outreach when there's a forecast of, say, 3 days of snow and large-scale snow. They will go out to the folks that they've been meeting on a regular basis and let them know, just in case they haven't heard a forecast, and offer services and just hope that they'll avail themselves of it. And typically they do not. I'm very concerned about having people remaining out in freezing weather. And I don't know how this would improve the situation. So, all right, thank you.
Well, I think we see some of the answers to that. I mean, it's again, the concern about losing everything you own. That's a real concern. And people are, as we heard from the Elevate Denver presentation as well, like people are weighing a lot when they make a decision about whether to go into available shelter, including that like violent acts of violence happen in those shelters. I mean, that a lot of factors, but I don't think sort of forcibly removing people is either an option or the right approach.
Perhaps. In the BK presentation, when I looked at the data, it seemed that those who responded, they felt they did not have adequate clothing to be outdoors. They did not have adequate shelter to keep themselves safe in freezing temperatures by a large margin. But also by a larger margin, they had fear of losing their personal belongings if they sought shelter during the winter. It seems to me that in those three graphs, there might be a solution if we could offer safe storage or some kind of retention of their personal property while they can get indoors. Might be a more affirmative or positive answer rather than just saying, okay, stay here while it's 0 degrees.
Say that the other thing I want to emphasize is that these provisions have been pushed for a really long time by a bunch of those who are most impacted. So part of what I'm doing here is just listening to that. And what I see here is the gravity of if you're so afraid of losing your personal belongings that you stay outdoors, despite the fact that you don't necessarily have adequate clothing or shelter. I would strongly prefer people not be in that situation, but I certainly don't want to put them out of a tent, I agree about the need for more safe storage options as well. I don't think that's as appropriate for an ordinance. And I think that would sort of, if we did a better job there, we might see more people choosing to move into shelter. I would love to see that. I don't think it takes away the necessity of allowing people to stay where they are when they're warm, when they do have a tent that they're living in.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. Seeing more folks coming into queue, just remember we have 16 minutes left in budget and policy. Councilwoman Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez.
Thank you, Council President. I'm sorry, is it okay that I also talk to other members on here? Like council
members? Yes.
Hines?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry, I wasn't sure. No, I just had a quick question. When you, for Councilman Hines, you made a statement. I want to make sure I actually heard it accurately because I had a question about it. When I think I heard you say something about having a concern, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Was it that you had a concern about this creating a policy around the temperature thresholds versus allowing public health experts to make a determination? I just want to make sure. If I misheard that, please correct me.
If I may, Council President.
Yes, please, Councilman Hines.
Yeah. So thank you, Councilmember Gonzalez Gutierrez. What I was saying is that I guess in an ideal world, our public health officials would provide this without having to legislate. I think legislation is kind of a hammer, but in this case, we see that we continue to have people lose limbs and lives. And so I would rather us preserve limbs and lives. And if we have to resort to legislation, then so be it.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I was just trying to make sure I understood because I think that's just something that I know, and I thank you, Councilwoman Parady and Councilwoman Lewis, for bringing this forward. And I really appreciate all the work that was done in this and all of the, I've met with Be Connected, and I really do appreciate the approach that they have in being able to look at the data and bring all this information together in a different kind of way. And I don't know that I necessarily have a great question, but more of just a comment around the whole, why we put policies in place for these kinds of issues, and knowing that if we have feedback and get information from our public health experts around, much like the presentation that we heard last week, much around, what are those thresholds and what does that look like, and utilize that to guide us in policy making and implementation. I am all for that every day. And we also know that we always learn new things. Science is ever evolving. We're always learning new information about how bodies react to things, how the brain works, all of those things. And so that allows us to then amend said policies as we go forward, and that's kind of what we do. So I just wanted to just put that out there as something that I really appreciate, and the attention that's been taken, and as far as the expertise that has been provided in guiding this policy. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Romero Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Sarah, Councilwoman Parady. I'm having a moment, sorry. And also Councilwoman Lewis for bringing this to council. Real quick question, and we had talked about this early on as far as the temperature and the guidelines and what makes sense and common sense. I do have for what kind of temperature to move people in and to make sure that they are safe. Has there been any thought about like wind chill factor and what that looks like? And so will that be something that will also be mentioned? Because you could have 32 degrees here, you have wind chill, and it could be, much, much colder, or 30 degrees could be something, or 40 degrees, I should say, would be a much colder temperature. Do you, or have you considered any language that would also include wind chill?
You brought that up, and I will say the advocates, I think you hear some of them snapping because we talked about this quite a bit. A 32-degree cutoff is, the reason for it is because that's freezing. That's when water freezes. That impacts human bodies in a certain way, but it's imperfect, and it doesn't actually, it doesn't perfectly capture. You could be at a higher temperature and have similar impacts. And so I think in an ideal world, we might say 32 degrees and lower, or 42 degrees with wind chill. Those things become harder to administer. And so we were trying to at least set a floor that would be very clear cut for agencies to comply with it and make it sort of easy for everyone to know what it's being complied with. But if I were doing this in a vacuum, I think going above 32 degrees when it was wet or where there was wind chill wouldn't be a bad idea. And I'm certainly open to that conversation if others on council would prefer to see it restructured in that way.
Yeah, I feel like it could almost be a 32 degrees and, and wind chill and include wind chill, because I think that's so significant, especially here in Colorado, especially in Denver. And that way we would, the news reports what the wind chill factor is. So I think that we would have a way to be able to record that and maybe, set a standard as to who we look to for that. But I think 32, if you err on the side of, let's go a little warmer. But that would be my preference. So if we would be willing to consider wind chill, I would like to be able to work with you on including that language as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm enthusiastic about that thought.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Watson.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, Councilwoman Parady and Councilwoman Lewis. I hope you feel better. Not so much specific questions for you, Councilwoman Parady. I know there's just a briefing. At safety, we're going to go a little bit deeper. We'll be able to ask more specific questions. One of the things I have for the administration prior to safety, and I'll ask this direct, whether it's DDPHE or the administration directly or host. Number one, someone that can come to council and answer the reason why it's at 20 degrees. Not kind of what possibly, but a specific rationale for 20 degrees. That's going to be helpful for us when making a decision. So if there's someone, and I'm staring at many members of the administration, if there's a person that can speak specifically to why 20 degrees, because this has been something that has been talked about for years. It's not just this past week. If someone can speak to why that is, that will be very helpful. The second piece would be for someone from the administration to be able to speak to when health and safety cleanups are occurring after freezing or around freezing. How frequently is that actually happening today? Is it happening today? Does the policy as it pertains today disallows folks for health and safety removals when temperatures dip? That would be very helpful as we get into this discussion and get a little deeper in this discussion. And someone from finance to speak to the cost of is there a cost impact and what that cost is when it comes to increasing warming shelters and cold sheltering as well. There's differences between both. Having someone from the administration to speak to that and any direct impacts, I think will inform the presentation from both council members and also will inform our ability to vote when this comes to safety in the next several weeks. I've shared with Councilwoman Parady and Councilwoman Lewis knows my family story already. This is very impactful and important for saving lives for folks who are living and dying on our streets. I think this decision to pass an ordinance has to be informed, from my perspective, from folks within the health community as well. And much of the work that you've done here has begun that process. So I would like to hear from Denver Health as well, for them to be a part of this discussion. So we have several weeks. I will have lots of very specific questions, but Councilwomen, I want to thank you so much for bringing this forward. If the 20 degrees is as arbitrary as it feels, then absolutely there has to be some discussions on that. If the opening of warming shelters tied to that is as arbitrary as it feels, that needs to be changed. When we're discussing the specific piece in this ordinance around health and safety and moving of encampments, we know that folks are dying in encampments. We know that there are fewer folks that are dying in shelter, up to housing. And that information needs to be a part of our dialogue, part of our discussion as this moves to safety. So thank you so much, Councilwoman Parady. Thank you so much, Councilwoman Lewis, for your good work on this. And I look forward to having a deeper discussion in the next few weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, Council President, and wanted to thank Council members Parady and Lewis for their work on this ordinance. And I would encourage folks, if they're interested in how the current standards came to be, it was in a safety committee that there was a presentation regarding the temperatures where we were not going to remove people or where we were going to open up really the cold sheltering. And it morphed during that committee meeting and kind of went all over the place. And so, in safety last week, it was very intentional. And I thank Councilmember Parady for doing that and inviting a medical doctor to present to council. And we all know that 32 degrees is the temperature that's a threshold that we need to take care and make sure that we're not trying to move people around. And the previous presentation, I think, was very clear in that the way that we treat people when it's a difficult situation, it either erodes or builds trust. And I think that there are some ways by listening to the advocates and partners that we can build trust in this way and supportive of entertaining and looking at this deeper to make sure that we can support those who are most in need, especially as we look at cold weather, but we're also going to have to probably consider sheltering and cooling stations with increased temperature or catastrophic weather conditions that we don't know that we might need to address as well. And so appreciate the work and the questions of my colleagues today. Thank you. Thank you, Council President Torres.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you again, Councilwoman Parady. I just want to clarify, like, my concern around the freezing temperature enforcement only being like overnight when there's like that threshold before and after. And I think that kind of goes to the wind chill question of like, I mean, I've camped outside when it's freezing and it's terrible. And all I want to do is stay put. I don't want to move. And that brings me a lot of peace to know that I don't have to move. And on another note, something that's been on my mind that I saw in the news about this weekend was that people were kicked out of shelter like at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. And I much rather stay in a tent overnight where I can actually try and get rest, even if it's like off and on, than get woken up at like 4 or 5 a.m. to like get pushed out into still freezing temperatures. And on top of that, there was also like I saw a story that covered like some violence that happened in the shelter. So people got kicked out due to the violence. So if we're going to kick people out, it seems counterproductive to kick people out if they have no place to go. And maybe they also just lost their tent because they chose to take shelter. So thank you for bringing up these concerns. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that basis. I really do think that looking at the draft that we have, I think the piece around sweeps is pretty well developed and kind of thought through. I think the piece around when to open the warming shelters needs some more details like that, like what you're referencing, because the issue of when the shelter closes could make the difference between people accessing it or not, right? So yeah, thank you for raising that.
Great. Thank you so much. My thanks as well. I think this is common sense as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for bringing it to budget and policy. Can you give us, did we pick a time for you to come to committee?
Scheduled for safety for December 20th. And I'm looking at the both ingoing and outcoming.
Is that when it's coming?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's December 20th.
December 20th. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the preview. And I think the alignment with what we also heard with Elevate Denver as well. So thank you, everybody. That's all our questions. Budget and policy is adjourned.